Hangar 3, Gulf Coast Rotorcraft, 10:07 at night. 3 helicopters sat dead on the concrete floor under rows of halogen lights. Kate Ellison stood at the center of the hangar, blazer over her work dress, looking at the maintenance crew. Fix all 3 helicopters by sunrise, or you're fired. Nobody moved. Matt Garner stood at the back of the line, grease on his hands, and looked straight at her. She turned and walked out, heels sharp on concrete. Matt watched her go. Then he looked at the 3 machines. He took off his jacket. This is one of those stories that hits different the longer you sit with it. Stay with it to the end, and you'll understand why. The apartment in Pasadena was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen counter that doubled as a desk. Matt Garner had lived there 8 months with his son Sam, and in that time the only thing he'd added to the walls was a clock. He woke at 5:30 every morning, made breakfast, drove Sam to Deer Park Elementary by 7:15, then crossed the ship channel to the Gulf Coast Rotorcraft facility on Ellington Field by 8. He packed Sam's lunch himself every morning, a sandwich and an apple and whatever snack was on sale that week at the grocery store. On nights when his shift ran late, Sam stayed with Mrs. Pruitt next door, a retired postal worker who kept a spare key and never asked questions. Tonight Matt had called her at 9:40. "Late one," he said. She told him Sam was already asleep on her couch with the television still on. Kate Ellison had taken over Gulf Coast Rotorcraft 2 years ago when her father stepped down after 3 decades at the helm. She was 31, the youngest CEO the company had ever had, and the board reminded her of that fact at every quarterly meeting. The company ran a fleet of 12 helicopters serving offshore oil platforms, emergency medical transport, and private charter across the Gulf Coast. The EMS contract with Memorial Hermann Health System was up for renewal, worth $4.2 million a year, and the renewal hinged on one condition: full fleet readiness. An FAA inspector was scheduled to arrive at 8 the next morning to verify that every aircraft listed on the contract was airworthy and properly maintained. 3 of them were not. Vince Kellner, VP of Operations, had called Kate at 9 that evening. 15 years at the company, passed over for the CEO position when her father retired, and he delivered the news the way he delivered everything, with a solution already attached. "The maintenance crew dropped the ball," he told her over the phone. 3 birds grounded, all with mechanical issues that should have been caught weeks ago. "If we don't pass tomorrow's inspection, Memorial Hermann walks." He let the silence hold for 2 beats, then added, "Might be time to clean house down there. Start fresh." Kate had driven to the facility herself. She'd stood in front of the crew and said what she said, word for word, the way Vince had framed it in her head on the drive over. Now, from the glass-walled office above the hangar floor, she watched 2 of the 4 mechanics grab their bags and walk out through the side door. One shook his head on the way out. The other didn't look back. That left 2. She looked down at the man who hadn't moved, the one who'd looked her in the eye while everyone else looked at the floor. She didn't know his name. Matt pulled out his phone and called Dan Rowley. "I need you tonight." Dan was there in 30 minutes. Ball cap pulled low, thermos of coffee in one hand, toolbox in the other. He set both down at the edge of the work area and looked at the 3 helicopters sitting dark and still under the overhead lights. The Bell 407 had a hydraulic servo valve failure. The AS-350 had a tail rotor gearbox oil leak with a worn bearing underneath. The Bell 412, the big twin-engine ship, had a main transmission chip light and a vibration anomaly that the day crew had written up 3 times without isolating the source. Dan let out a slow breath through his teeth. Matt was already opening his toolbox, laying out wrenches by size on the magnetic strip, moving with the economy of a man who'd already calculated the order of operations in his head. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Matt started with the Bell 407. He pulled the cowling panels, exposing the engine bay and the hydraulic system below, located the servo valve on the port side, and began disassembly. His hands moved without hesitation. He didn't open the maintenance manual. He didn't pull up the diagram on the shop computer. He didn't pause to reference the part number or the torque specifications. He worked from a place deeper than procedure, the kind of fluency that only comes from having done something thousands of times across years and aircraft types until the knowledge doesn't live in your head anymore. It lives in your hands. He had the valve out in 12 minutes. He inspected the seals under the magnifying lamp, found the failure, a hairline fracture on the inner seal ring, pulled a replacement from the parts shelf, and began reassembly. The whole job, valve removal through reinstallation and ground test, should have taken a competent mechanic 90 minutes. Matt finished in 50. Dan stood behind him with his arms folded, watching. He'd known Matt Garner for 6 years, 3 of those in the service and 3 in the civilian world, but he hadn't seen him work with this kind of intensity in a long time. Not since before. "You're still doing it the 60 Sierra way," Dan said quietly. Matt paused for half a second, wrench in his left hand, right hand holding the new seal in position. Then he kept going. Dan had served aboard the USS Bataan in a different maintenance detachment, but close enough to know what Matt Garner actually was. Not a line mechanic. Not even a senior technician. Matt had been a Navy aviation maintenance officer, an AMO, responsible for the complete maintenance program of an H-60 Seahawk helicopter squadron. He'd led a detachment of 42 technicians. He'd signed off on airframes that flew combat search and rescue over open water, where a maintenance error didn't mean a write-up, it meant someone didn't come home. He held qualifications on flight control systems, drivetrain assemblies, and avionics suites that most civilian mechanics would never encounter in an entire career. When his wife Jenny died in a car accident 3 years ago, Matt requested and received a hardship discharge. His security clearance lapsed 6 months later. The defense contractors who would have hired him for 6 figures required active clearance. By the time he'd settled in Houston with Sam, enrolled the boy in school, and started applying for work, the only open position at Gulf Coast Rotorcraft was line mechanic. $12 above minimum wage. He took it. He told Dan, who'd been at the company for 2 years already, to keep his mouth shut. Dan had respected that. But tonight, watching Matt strip and rebuild a hydraulic servo valve from memory, like a man tuning a guitar he'd played his whole life, Dan wondered if keeping quiet was loyalty or waste. Kate came down from the office at 11:45. She stopped at the edge of the work area, 3 steps from the Bell 407, and looked at it. The cowling was back on. The hydraulic lines were reconnected. Matt was running a ground power check on the system, reading gauges, writing numbers on a clipboard. She looked at the helicopter, then at the man. How? Matt didn't look up. Servo valve. 30-year-old design. Not complicated. He said it the way someone describes a task that bores them. She stood there a few more seconds, trying to reconcile the timeline. She'd been gone less than 2 hours. Then she turned and went back upstairs. But she paused at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing. Not because of the speed, though that was part of it. Because of something she couldn't put a name to yet. The way he moved around the aircraft. Not like a man following instructions. Like a man who'd written them. 1 helicopter down. 2 to go. 6 hours and 15 minutes until sunrise. And upstairs, on Kate's desk, her phone buzzed again. Vince Kellner calling for the 3rd time since she'd left the hangar floor. Same message every time. Fire them all. Make an example. Rebuild the department from scratch. The phone lit up in the dim office. She looked at it for a long moment. She didn't pick up. Matt and Dan moved to the AS-350. Dan pulled the tail rotor gearbox cover while Matt positioned the inspection light and laid out the tools he'd need in a row along the workstand. The oil leak was obvious, pooled dark and heavy beneath the housing, streaked along the tail boom in a pattern that said this hadn't happened overnight. Matt reached in and rotated the output shaft by hand. The bearing ground against itself with a sound like sand in a socket, worn well past tolerance. He pulled the bearing assembly, held it under the magnifying lamp, and turned it slowly in his fingers. Then he set it on the workbench and opened the maintenance tracking system on the shop laptop. The work order was right there, dated 4 months ago. Tail rotor gearbox bearing replacement on this aircraft. Status, completed. Signed off digitally by Vincent Kellner, VP of Operations, authorizing officer. But the bearing Matt had just pulled from the gearbox was the original factory unit. Same manufacturer stamp. Same part lot code. Were pattern consistent with 18 months of flight hours, not 4 months since replacement. It had never been replaced. Someone had signed a work order saying it had, but the old bearing was still in the aircraft. Still grinding. Still leaking. Matt took a photo with his phone. Close-up of the part number stamped into the bearing race. Then another, the screen of the laptop showing Vince's digital signature on the completed work order. He set the phone face down on the bench and pulled a new bearing from the parts shelf without a word. Dan looked at the laptop screen over Matt's shoulder. He read the signature line twice. That's Vince's name on the sign-off. Matt pressed the new bearing into the housing with a steady, even push. I know. Dan stood there. You going to report it? Matt picked up the torque wrench. Let's get through the night first. Kate came back down at 1 in the morning. This time she didn't stop at the edge of the work area. She walked all the way to the bench, close enough to see the oil stains on Matt's forearms, and looked at the AS-350 with its gearbox open under the light. She didn't ask about the helicopter. She asked a different question. Why are you still here? Matt tightened a bolt to spec, checked it with the torque wrench, then moved to the next one. Because the work needs doing. She shook her head slightly. Everyone else walked out. You've been threatened with your job, and you haven't said one word about it. Matt set the torque wrench down on the bench and looked at her for the first time since she'd delivered the ultimatum in the hangar. The aircraft don't care who's mad at who. They either fly safe or they don't. Kate didn't respond right away. In 2 years of running this company, no one had said anything that direct to her. Not the board members with their prepared remarks. Not Vince with his polished recommendations. Not the lawyers or the accountants. This man, standing under a fluorescent light at 1 in the morning with oil on his shirt and no reason to be polite, had said the truest thing she'd heard since she took the job. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she asked, "What do you need?" Matt picked the wrench back up. The parts Vince said he ordered last quarter. About half of them never showed up. Kate pulled out her phone and typed a note to herself. She looked at him one more time, then went back upstairs. But this time she didn't sit down at her desk. She stood at the window overlooking the hangar floor and watched Matt work. And for the first time in months, she felt the ground shift beneath the version of events she'd built her management around. Vince's confident briefings, his budget projections, his reliable, smooth reports that always ended with the same conclusion. Everything is under control. She looked down at the man who hadn't left and wondered what else she'd been wrong about. By 2 in the morning, the AS-350 was done. Matt cleaned the gearbox housing, refilled the oil to the marked level, ran the tail rotor through a manual rotation sequence, and listened. Smooth. No grind. He signed the logbook entry and moved his tools to the next station. 2 down. 1 to go. The Bell 412 was the aircraft Matt had been thinking about since 10 o'clock. Main transmission ship light, plus a vibration anomaly that the day crew had written up 3 separate times over the past 2 weeks without isolating the cause. This was not a single component swap. This was diagnostic work. The kind that required understanding not just the failed part, but the entire mechanical system it lived inside, the way forces transferred through the drivetrain, the resonance signatures of each component, the difference between a vibration caused by a worn bearing and one caused by a misaligned input shaft. Matt climbed up onto the maintenance stand and began the transmission inspection sequence while Dan set up the vibration analysis equipment on the floor below. They fell into a rhythm that didn't need language. Dan handed tools up before Matt called for them. Matt read pressure values aloud, and Dan logged them on the clipboard without asking him to repeat. It was the kind of coordination born from shared history. 2 men who'd once done this work in a helicopter maintenance bay aboard a ship rolling in Atlantic swells, where a dropped wrench went overboard and a missed torque spec meant a crash at sea. The hangar was dry and level and still, but the rhythm was the same. They'd carried it with them the way soldiers carry a walk. Kate came down at 2:30. This time she carried 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine, steam curling off the rims. She set them on the edge of the workbench without a word. Matt reached down from the stand, took one, nodded once. Kate stepped back, but didn't leave. She watched his hands working inside the transmission bay. Scars across the knuckles from years she couldn't account for. Calluses so thick they caught the light differently from the rest of his skin. But the movements themselves were careful, deliberate, almost delicate, each finger placed with intention. She'd spent 2 years in conference rooms watching people handle spreadsheets and slide decks. She had never watched someone work with their hands this way. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. Matt adjusted a dial on the vibration analyzer without looking up. "Long enough." He didn't offer more. She didn't push. But she stayed for another full minute, holding her own coffee, standing in the oil and metal smell of the hangar at 2:30 in the morning. Her phone rang. "Vince." She walked to the far end of the hangar to take the call, her voice low. "Cut him loose," Vince said. "I don't care if he finishes all 3. The guy's a liability. Send a message to the rest of the crew." Kate looked across the hangar floor. Matt was shoulder deep in the transmission housing, headlamp on, entirely focused. Dan was below him reading gauges. Neither of them had looked up at the sound of her phone. "Let me see what happens by morning," Kate said. The line went quiet. 3 full seconds. In 15 years at Gulf Coast Rotorcraft, Vince Kellner had never heard Kate Ellison push back on one of his recommendations. Not once. He said goodnight and hung up. Kate put the phone back in her pocket and stood very still in the far corner of the hangar. She was beginning to measure the distance between what Vince told her from his office and what she could see with her own eyes at 2:30 in the morning on a hangar floor. The gap had been there for a while. She just hadn't been standing in the right place to see it. At 3:30 in the morning, Matt found it. Input coil bearing on the main transmission, worn past service limit, throwing a vibration through the entire drivetrain that cascaded into the chip detector and triggered the warning light. He needed to replace it. He climbed down from the stand, wiped his hands, and walked to the parts room at the back of the hangar. Dan followed. They went through the shelves systematically, bin by bin, cross-referencing the part number against the labels on each shelf. The bearing wasn't there. Matt pulled up the procurement system on the parts room computer. Vince had signed a purchase order for the bearing 5 months ago. Budget line approved. Funds disbursed. $4,700. Vendor listed, shipping method selected, everything filled in correctly. But the part had never arrived. No shipping confirmation in the system. No receiving log entry. No one had signed for it at the loading dock. The money had left the company account. The bearing had never entered the building. Matt and Dan stood on opposite sides of the parts counter, the computer screen glowing between them. Neither of them said it out loud. The purchase order was clean. The money was gone. The part was absent. There was only one conclusion, and it led upstairs. Matt didn't stop. He walked through the back door of the parts room into the machine shop, a small bay with a lathe, a milling machine, a drill press, and a welding station. He turned on the overhead lights, powered up the lathe, and began measuring stock aluminum from the material rack. What he built over the next 45 minutes was not a replacement bearing. It was a load transfer adapter, a precision machine sleeve that redistributed the mechanical forces around the worn bearing through an alternate structural path, reducing the vibration below the threshold that would trigger the chip detector. It was field-expedient maintenance, the kind of improvisation they taught in advanced military airframe courses for scenarios where the correct part didn't exist within 1,000 miles and the aircraft still had to fly. A line mechanic would never attempt it. A line mechanic wouldn't know how. Kate was still in the hangar. She hadn't gone back to the office since 2:30. She sat in a folding chair near the office door, arms crossed, watching through the machine shop window as Matt stood at the lathe with a micrometer and a set of calipers, measuring, cutting, test fitting, measuring again. She didn't understand what he was building. She didn't understand the engineering behind it. But she understood what she was watching. This was not a man performing a job above his pay grade. This was a man performing a job beneath it. The question of the adapter hung in the air. Whether it would hold. Whether the FAA inspector would accept a field repair on a main transmission component. Whether everything Matt had done tonight would be invalidated by a judgment call at 8 in the morning. None of them spoke it. All of them felt it. And in a house in the woodlands, north of the city, Vince Kellner was not asleep. He was sitting at his home office desk with the door locked, moving files from a company-synced folder on his personal laptop to an encrypted drive. Vince knew something nobody on the hangar floor had figured out yet. The 3 grounded helicopters were not an accident or a coincidence. They were the first visible fractures in a structure he'd been hollowing out for 14 months. And the man fixing them was getting dangerously close to seeing the whole thing. At 4:15 in the morning, while Matt was underneath the Bell 412 fitting the machined adapter into the transmission assembly, Dan Rowley sat at the shop computer pulling maintenance records. He needed the transmission serial number for the logbook entry he was preparing, a routine administrative task at the end of a long night. He typed the aircraft tail number and opened the full maintenance history. Then he stopped scrolling. He went back to the top of the list. He opened a different aircraft's records. Then another. Then 3 more. He began clicking through work orders, slowly at first, then faster, pulling up each one, checking the sign-off line, checking the part's receiving log, comparing dates. He started printing. Page after page came out of the shop printer, each one a maintenance work order, each one marked completed, each one signed by Vincent Kellner. bearing replacements, seal kits, hydraulic filter assemblies, gearbox overhaul components. 23 work orders spread across 9 aircraft in the fleet, spanning 14 months. Every single one listed as completed in the maintenance tracking system. Every single one with parts that had been budgeted, approved, and paid for. But when Dan cross-referenced each work order against the physical parts receiving log at the loading dock, more than half the parts had no record of arrival. $180,000 in maintenance work that existed only as entries in a database and signatures on a screen. Dan gathered the printouts. He squared the edges against the desk. He carried the stack upstairs to Kate's office and set it down in front of her without commentary. She looked at him. He tapped the top page with one finger. "You need to read these." Kate read them, one page at a time. She didn't rush. She turned each sheet over and set it face down when she finished. By the 9th page, her jaw was locked tight, the muscles along the sides of her neck standing out like cables. By the 15th page, her hands were pressed flat on the desk surface, fingers spread, as if she was trying to hold the desk in place. She finished the 23rd page and sat completely still for a long moment. She understood now. Not part of it. All of it. The 3 grounded helicopters were not a maintenance crew failure. They were the edge of a fraud that her most trusted executive had been running through the company's maintenance budget for over a year. Parts ordered and paid for that never arrived. Work signed off as complete that was never done. Aircraft flying with components that should have been replaced months or years ago. And tonight she had walked into a hangar and threatened to fire the man who was the only thing standing between those aircraft and a catastrophic failure. Kate stood. She walked down the stairs to the hangar floor. Matt was still under the Bell 412, flat on his back on the creeper, headlamp cutting a cone of white light into the shadow of the transmission housing. She stood 6 feet from the aircraft. She wanted to speak, but he was in the middle of a torque sequence on the adapter, and she understood enough about precision work to know that interrupting a man at this stage was not respect. So she stood there. Matt could see her shoes at the edge of his headlamp light. They both knew the other was aware. Neither of them spoke. The silence carried more honesty than any apology she could have assembled from the words available to her at 4:30 in the morning. She stayed until he finished the sequence. Then she went back upstairs and sat behind her desk to wait. At 5 in the morning, Matt Garner finished the Bell 412. He ran the final checks himself. Oil pressure within range. Hydraulic response clean on both systems. Vibration readings on 3 axes, all below threshold. The chip detector was silent. He powered down the ground test equipment, disconnected the external power unit, and climbed down from the maintenance stand for the last time. 3 helicopters. 7 hours. All airworthy. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, folded it twice, and set it on the workbench. He placed every tool back in its correct slot, closed the lid, and latched it. Then he unclipped his employee badge from his belt and held it in his palm for a moment, turning it over once. Dan was sitting in a folding chair by the side door, arms crossed, fighting sleep. He opened one eye and watched Matt walk toward the stairs. Kate heard the footsteps on the metal stairs before she saw him. She stood up from behind the desk. Matt came through the office doorway, grease on his forearms up to the elbows, hair pressed flat in a band where the headlamp strap had sat for 3 hours. He walked to the desk, stood across from her, and placed his badge on the surface between them. "I'm done." Kate looked at the badge, then at him. "Because of what I said tonight. Because I won't work somewhere that treats people as disposable." His voice was level. No edge to it. No performance. Just the fact of it, spoken the way he'd spoken everything tonight, plain and without decoration. "You didn't know my name before tonight. You don't know anyone's name down there. You walked into a room full of people who keep your aircraft in the air, and you threatened every one of them because someone in an office upstairs told you to." Kate didn't argue. She didn't offer a defense. She couldn't. Everything he said was true, and standing 3 feet from the man who'd just spent 7 hours proving it, she had nothing to counter with. "I'll make changes," she said. "Starting now, the way things have been run here is going to be different." Matt looked at her. Not cold, not warm, steady. The look of a man who has heard promises before and learned to trust hands over words. "You might," he said, "but I already made my decision." He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a door without slamming it, and turned toward the doorway. He went down the stairs, crossed the hangar floor, shook Dan's hand without a word, picked up his jacket from the workbench, and walked out through the side door into the parking lot. Kate picked up her phone and called Vince Kellner. It rang 4 times. When he answered, his voice had the rehearsed quality of a man who always knew what he was going to say before the conversation started. She didn't let him get there. "You're suspended effective immediately. I have 23 work orders with your signature on them for maintenance that was never performed and parts that were never delivered. $180,000 in company funds. Do not contact me, do not contact anyone at this company, and do not access any company systems. My next call is to the FAA." She hung up before he finished his first word. Her hand was steady the entire time. Then she walked out of the office, down the stairs, through the hangar, and out the side door. Matt was at his truck in the parking lot. The driver's door was open. His keys were in his hand. The parking lot lights cast a flat yellow wash over the asphalt. Kate stopped 3 steps away. 5:15 in the morning. Her blazer was wrinkled. His shirt was dark with hydraulic fluid. Neither of them resembled the people they'd been 7 hours ago. "You were right," she said. "I didn't know your name." Matt looked at her. Something crossed his face, not quite anger, not quite forgiveness. Something between the two that didn't have a word. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, climbed into the truck, and pulled out of the lot. Kate stood on the asphalt and watched his taillights turn east onto Aerospace Avenue and disappear into the first gray light of a Houston morning. The FAA inspector arrived at 8. He spent 90 minutes in the hangar with his clipboard and his checklists, walking around each aircraft, checking maintenance logs against physical conditions, running 2 of the 3 through a ground power test. He signed off on all 3. The Bell 412's adapter was noted as a field expedient repair, approved for a limited flight hour cycle pending replacement with the original specification bearing. He wrote in his report that the repair demonstrated an unusually high level of technical competence. Kate signed the EMS contract renewal with Memorial Hermann at 9:15. At 9:30, she called an all-hands meeting in the hangar. She stood in front of the remaining maintenance crew, the mechanics who'd worked the morning shift and the 2 who'd walked out the night before. She didn't use notes, and she didn't soften it. "Last night, I came into this hangar and treated all of you like the problem. I was wrong. The problem was somewhere else, and I didn't see it because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. That changes today. Effective immediately, all maintenance operations report directly to me. No intermediaries. No filters. If something's wrong with an aircraft, I want to hear it from the people who put their hands on it, not from someone reading a spreadsheet on the 3rd floor." She didn't say Matt's name. She didn't tell his story. But every person in the room knew exactly who had stayed in the hangar until 5 in the morning. The 2 mechanics who'd left couldn't meet each other's eyes. After the meeting emptied, Dan Rowley stayed behind. Kate stood near the open hangar door, looking out at the flight line, the helicopters sitting in morning light. "Who is he?" she asked without turning around. Dan told her. No embellishment, no editorial. Navy Aviation Maintenance Officer. H-60 Seahawk Squadron aboard the USS Bataan. Led a detachment of 42. Wife died 3 years ago. Took a hardship discharge. Clearance lapsed. Came to Houston. Took the only job that was open. He didn't want anyone here to know, Dan said. Asked me to keep it quiet his first week. So I did. He paused. He won't call you. He's not built that way. Dan picked up his thermos from the workbench. But Saturday mornings, he's home with his boy. Apartment complex off Spencer Highway in Pasadena, 2nd floor, blue door. Kate went back to her office. She sat in her chair and looked down through the glass at the empty hangar floor. Matt's work area was spotless. Tools put away. Rags folded. The workbench wiped down. The shop looked like no one had been there all night, which was exactly how he'd have wanted it. The only evidence that Matt Garner had ever worked at Gulf Coast Rotorcraft was the badge still sitting on her desk. She picked it up and turned it over. The photo was from his hiring date, a year old. He wasn't smiling in it. She set it back down and opened her laptop to start pulling every financial record connected to Vince Kellner's department. She had an investigation to build and an FAA cooperation package to assemble and a maintenance department to restructure from the ground up. But she kept looking at the badge. Saturday afternoon, Kate drove south on Beltway 8 toward Pasadena. She'd changed before leaving. No blazer, no heels. A plain white shirt and jeans and flat shoes. She couldn't remember the last time she'd visited someone without looking like a title. She found the apartment complex off Spencer Highway, parked between a pickup truck and a sedan, and walked up the outdoor staircase to the second floor. The door was blue, slightly faded by the sun. She knocked. A boy opened it. 8 years old, brown hair cut short, a quiet face that looked like a smaller copy of the man she'd watched work for 7 hours. He studied her without suspicion and without greeting. "My dad's in the kitchen," he said, and stepped back. The apartment was clean and sparse. A bookshelf along one wall held a row of model airplanes arranged by size. At the dining table, a half-assembled F-14 Tomcat sat on a sheet of newspaper, tiny parts organized in a muffin tin. Sam sat back down and picked up a wing section. Kate lowered herself to the floor across from him. "That's an F-14. Sam glanced at her. "Tomcat. Retired in 2006. Variable sweep wing." He held up the hinge piece. "This part's hard because you have to set the pivot before the glue dries or the angle comes out wrong." Same cadence as his father. Precise and patient. No extra words. Matt came from the kitchen with 2 glasses of water. He stopped in the doorway. Kate was sitting cross-legged on his floor, watching his son explain wing geometry. She looked up at him. "He knows his planes," she said. Matt set the glasses down and sat in the chair across from Sam. Nobody spoke for a moment. Sam fitted the wing and held the model at arm's length, checking alignment. Kate didn't start with small talk. "Director of maintenance," she said. "Full authority over every maintenance operation. All purchase orders require your signature. You report to me. No one overrides a grounding decision except you." Matt didn't answer. Kate continued. "I'm not offering because of Friday night. I'm offering because I spent 7 hours watching the only person in that hangar who actually cared whether those aircraft fly safe." Matt looked at her. Not through halogen haze. Not from under a helicopter at 4 in the morning. Here, in his apartment, in afternoon light, with his son 3 feet away. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to let them into a part of your life you've been guarding alone. "I'll think about it," he said. Kate nodded. She stood, said goodbye to Sam, who waved without looking up from his paintbrush, and walked to the door. Matt followed. At the threshold, she turned. "Whatever you decide. Thank you for Friday night." She left. Matt watched her walk down the stairs to the parking lot. Behind him, Sam's voice came from the table. "She knew it was a Tomcat, Dad." Matt closed the door and sat back down. He took the job. On his terms. Full authority over every maintenance decision. Every purchase order co-signed by him. Any grounding call final and not subject to review from operations, the front office, or the board. Kate agreed to every condition in a 15-minute meeting Monday morning without negotiating a single point. She printed the offer letter, signed it across from him, and shook his hand. Vince Kellner was terminated the following Wednesday. The company's legal counsel delivered the notice at his home. No scene, no confrontation, just a letter, a box for his key card, and a reminder that his computer and phone access had already been revoked. The FAA opened a formal investigation into the falsified maintenance records. Gulf Coast Rotorcraft cooperated fully, turning over every document Kate and Dan had assembled. The case would move slowly, the way these things always do, but Vince Kellner would never sign another work order again. 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Matt stood in the hangar signing a flight release for the Bell 412. The same aircraft he'd repaired at 4 in the morning with a hand-machined adapter and no sleep. He wore a company polo with his name stitched above the pocket. Not a coverall. Dan stood beside him with a torque wrench, wearing the kind of grin that comes from watching something you knew a long time ago finally become visible to everyone else. Sam came by after school the way he did on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He sat in the corner of the maintenance office with his backpack on the floor, working on a new model. A Black Hawk this time. The mechanics who passed the window gave him a nod, and he nodded back. He belonged there the way his father did. Kate came down to the hangar at 4:30 carrying a folder. Inside was a quarterly budget report she could have emailed. She'd been doing this since September, finding paper reasons to walk from the 3rd floor to the maintenance bay, and the frequency had been increasing. Dan noticed. The crew noticed. Matt noticed, but said nothing. She handed him the folder. Their fingers met on the edge of it, and neither pulled away for a moment longer than the task required. The folder hung between them. Then Matt took it, set it on the desk, and said he'd review page 4. Kate mentioned something about a line item. Both of them knew the folder was not why she was there. Dan glanced over from the workbench, saw the two of them standing a foot apart with a budget report between them like it was the most important document in the building, and turned around. He picked up a torque wrench that was already calibrated and began calibrating it again. At the end of shift, the crew gone, Sam asleep in the office chair with the half-finished Black Hawk resting on his lap, Matt walked Kate to the wide hangar door. It was rolled open to the taxiway, and beyond it the runway stretched south toward the Gulf. The Houston sky was turning from white to orange to a deep red that sat along the horizon like it had nowhere else to be. They stood side by side in the doorway, not touching, not speaking, close enough that if either one shifted weight, their shoulders would meet. Neither of them had been looking, but neither of them looked away.